we're now going to begin one of the most important foundational topics of music theory, and that's intervals and scales. So, what's important about this is that we have two axes that we're thinking about with music, the vertical and the horizontal. And the vertical axis is harmony, the simultaneous occurrence of two or more pitches. And then melody, of course, is a succession of pitches over time. And the vertical axis is made up of intervals, the distance between two notes, and it can be from two notes to almost an infinite number. The melodies are made up of leaps, steps, and skips, and scale fragments, as we'll see. And then when we put the two together, we get something called counterpoint, which is melody against melody. And that becomes pretty much the foundation for Western music. Now, the building blocks for music theory are these: intervals, which is the distance between two notes, scales, and modes. So that's the succession of notes in a stepwise motion, mostly, with a prescribed pattern of intervals. And then melody, which is another succession of notes, usually with a sense of phrases and harmonic direction, kind of like sentences. And then chords, which are three or more notes played simultaneously. Now we put all these things together and we get the structure of music theory. Now all scales and melodies are made of melodic intervals. The foundational scale for Western music is the major scale, and will be used pretty much as the basis for all our tonal music. Melodies, which are successions of intervals, are what we will create as composers. And to make them sound coherent and make sense, we'll compose them over previously established conventions, dating all the way back to the 18th century. Now, later on, one can deviate from these, but they're foundational in the sense they really teach us the way to combine intervals and notes in a very logical and very familiar pattern. So what is an interval? It is the distance between any two notes. So let's listen to melodic intervals and harmonic intervals. I'm going to play that again. And the C, E, G melodic intervals are a succession, as you can see on the graph. Harmonic intervals occur simultaneously. Listen to it again. So when we're referring to intervals, we'll always be referring either to melodic or harmonic intervals. And we have certain ways of talking about intervals for the size of them. We have steps, skips, and leaps, especially for melodic intervals. And I'll define each of these for you. So a step is a distance of two notes a second apart. In other words, right next to each other. A skip is a distance of two notes a third apart. That means there's one note in between them. So it skips that note and goes to the next one. So for instance, instead of C, D, E, it goes C to E. It skips the D. And then a leap is anything larger. It's usually a fourth or a larger interval apart. So let's say we're going C, D, E, F. C jumping up to F, skipping those other two notes, would be known as a fourth. And then we have fifths and sixths and sevenths. And that, once again, is almost infinite. So we really classify them this way. So if you look at the chart, it says melodic movement by seconds. You can see the C to the D, the A to the B, G to A. And then melodic movement by thirds, which almost sounds like chords when we play them. The C to E, the A to C, the G to B. And then leaps, movements by fourths or larger. And you can see just on the graph how far apart those notes are. The easiest ones to sing are melodic intervals by seconds. Harmonic intervals have generic names, a step, a skip, and a leap as well. So you can see that the harmonic and melodic intervals are very much related. Now we have something called diatonic. And a diatonic interval is an interval that belongs to a different key. So the word diatonic means belonging to a key. So for instance, these are the diatonic intervals for the key of C. So notice that both the melodic and harmonic intervals have the same size name. So we start with a unison, two instruments, two voices singing or playing the same note. Then it moves by second, by third, by fourth, and they sound like this. Third, fourth, sixth. So those are the melodic intervals. Now you'll have to memorize all of the intervals and identify them. And I have a system for doing that called exclusion sets that makes it very easy. And then using your Tenuto app or the equivalent of that will really help you identify that. Now here are the harmonic intervals. So you'll notice that those have the same name in terms of distance. The distance meaning the distance of the bottom note to the top note. So scales, modes, melodies, and chords. These are all basically foundational. So listen to Miles Davis. What you're hearing is a collection of modes and scales. And then, of course, the intervals at the beginning help set up a recognizable motive or idea. So we're going to use all of that to create what we consider to be our normal or popular or traditional Western music. And what's really cool is that scales and modes are nothing more than the succession of notes in stepwise motion, mostly, with a prescribed pattern of intervals. Now we'll get that. And scales are a succession of pitches with prescribed intervals, usually defining a tonality or a key center. And that's usually the starting note of that particular scale. And then modes are a succession of pitches derived from the scale degrees of a tonal scale. We'll talk about that and I'll demonstrate that to you. And the melodic way to combine intervals is what gives us the forward momentum in music. So for instance, like I said before, scales are made mostly from steps, which are seconds. Now there are exceptions, of course, like harmonic minor below. So here's what the major scale sounds like. And then the C harmonic minor, which has actually a skip, even though it looks like a step. This A flat to B natural is not a second. It actually sounds like a minor third. Now it's written like a second, but it doesn't sound that way. So listen to the succession. We get to listen to these things and identify them by hearing them. And your Tenuto app will help with that. You're very familiar with this. Now here's the harmonic minor. Now what's really cool about this is they each have a prescribed pattern of intervals. Notice in C major that between C and D is a whole step. Between D and E is a whole step. Between E and F is a half step. Well, it's these distances between the notes that determine the scale's key, its quality, and its style. So the major scales are most important for us to consider. And it's constructed with a series of half steps and whole steps, like I just mentioned. On the piano, we can illustrate it very easily. So W will stand for whole step, H will stand for half step. If you look at the keyboard, you'll see that every single key on the piano, so if I start with this C and I look at the back of the keyboard, between every note, the distance between each note is a half step. If you look at the back of the keyboard. So between C and this black note, that's a half step. Between that black note and D, it's another half step. But between C and D, if I skip a note, skip a key on the keyboard, I get a whole step. So look at the pattern. It's whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Now that translates into notation, which gives us this C major scale. So you can see the formula. Now that is immutable. If we want a C major scale if we want a major scale and we want to start on C, those are the only possible notes we can use. Well, this is transposable, which means, let's suppose I start on the note F. Well, if I go F, G, A, B, C, D, E, and F, those 7 different notes and then the repeated note an octave higher, the B doesn't follow the pattern because it creates whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half. But we need to have the half step between the 3rd and 4th notes of the scale. So to do that and make it work, I have to go F, G, A, B flat. I have to change the B and flat it. Then it corresponds exactly to this whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half pattern. And so the key signature is just a shorthand for adding that flat. And what it means is that all B's that are in that particular piece up to that point, unless they're altered with another sign, are going to be played B flat. It's just shorthand. So the resulting shifting, the starting note of the major scale, means we have to apply that pattern and we have to add sharps or flats to make it work. So because the scales start on different notes and to keep that pattern happening, accidentals must be added, like I just said. And the term accidental means sharps and flats. So if you look at this, I've given you C major, then it goes to F, and look what we had to add, 1 flat. B flat, I have to add 2 flats to make the pattern work, and so on. So a key signature is nothing more than a series of sharps or flats added to the beginning section of the music to indicate which notes are raised or lowered to maintain a prescribed pattern. And this is done for notational convenience. The scales in the example above all conform to the whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half major scale pattern. So this is true for all major scales, and here they are. Starting on other notes, create multiple key signatures. And this is how we got key signatures. And originally it started out with a term called musica ficta, which we'll learn about in counterpoint, which was the addition of sharps or flats. We also have names for these, and they're called ordinal numbers. These ordinal numbers are known as scale degrees, and they indicate the size of intervals and chords and the relative position of a note in relationship to the tonic. Now that's kind of a long explanation, but we're going to number every one of those scale degrees, and that gives us a lot of information. So the name is a name which indicates the position of a particular note on a scale relative to the starting note, which is known as the tonic. It's where we get tonality from. The tonic and the first and main note of the scale from which each octave begins, and from the scale into keys get their names. So that's what we have these names for. And the names are like this: tonic, supertonic, median, subdominant, dominant, submedian, subtonic, leading tone, and tonic. They're functional names, and in later lectures and in the class lecture, I'll explain why these names came about and the importance of what's known as the gravity of the tonic, that first note. Now, when we talk about their number, we use a caret, C-A-R-E-T, a little like a circumflex symbol above the number to indicate which scale degree it is. And it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in this case, flat 7, 7, and 8. That becomes very functional and easy for us to remember. So when I talk about a perfect fourth, you'll know that it's the fourth note above a certain note, etc. And these functional scale names are explained in this particular diagram. I won't talk about it right now, but it's on your PowerPoint for further study, and we will spend a lot of time on this to see how this all works. And then the ordinal numbers and functional names are key specific. So if I'm in the key of C, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I move to the key of D, the numbering starts over again because D now is the tonic and it gets the 1 and goes 1 through 8 and so on. So the major scale then is said to have been transposed. A new starting note with the same major scale pattern. The names in that new key of the scales, the tonic major scale of that key, remain the same. Tonic, supertonic, medium, and so on. Now, this will get really easy for you the more we do it. So please do the exercises that are set up in the PDF for you, and then we'll continue this more in class.